Good evening, gentlemen. We are starting, with God's help, a new chapter of the Holy Tanya, the Tanya Kadisha. We are up to Perek Vav, chapter 6 of the Holy Tanya. Last week, with God's help, we concluded our go-through of chapter 5, where we were talking about Torah and Torah study. For those who can't remember, the end of last week's class, where we reviewed all the chapters thus far very briefly. Chapter 1 was about the animal soul. Chapter 2 is about the godly soul. Chapter 3 is about the faculties of the godly soul, the 10 faculties. Chapter 4 is about the 3 garments of the godly soul. And chapter 5 was a special chapter about Torah and how Torah has advantages over even mitzvahs and the other garments of the godly soul, thought, speech, and action. Chapter 6, as promised, we will be going back to the animal soul. We're going to be talking about the nefesh habahamis. The general flow here is like this. Chapter 6 is about defining the concepts of klipa and sitra achra. That's really the main flow here of chapter 6. At the beginning, basically today's class, maybe including next week's as well, we'll talk about the parallel faculties in the animal soul to the godly soul, but that's a very brief discussion because most of the information is the same. It's just that the animal soul is very similar to the godly soul in many ways. In chapter 7, we will talk about this special thing in more detail called klipas noga. What do we mean by this special klipa, the translucent klipa, which is halfway between holiness and the 3 impure klippas, whatever all of that means? We'll definitely get into all of that. And chapter 8 is about separation from God in one's day-to-day life. That's really what chapter 8 is about. So, in other words, you could say, if you're trying to be cheeky, you could say chapter 6 is about the permitted, chapter 7 is about the forbidden, and chapter 8 is about the consequences. Basically, between the permitted, the forbidden, good evening, the permitted, the forbidden, and the consequences, you have most of what we call day-to-day life on planet Earth. That basically covers almost everything, except for the realm of holiness, which we've been discussing for the past 4 chapters. Everything else falls under the heading of the permitted, the forbidden, and the consequences. That is separation from God. I want to, before we start chapter 6, I want to briefly review all of the points, all of the main points we said about the animal soul all the way back in chapter 1, to refresh in your memory basically what we said about the animal soul, the nefesh habahamis, the nefesh hativis, the natural soul or biological soul, back in chapter 1. And then we will continue, and all of those points you'll see over the next 3 chapters will be given much more flesh on the bone, much more depth as we get into this in-depth discussion of things that are not holy, which is basically the topic of the next 3 chapters. Again, we said even really we should review something from even before chapter 1, or what we discussed right when we started Tanya, which is that the Tanya's priorities are obviously very different than our own. Right? The way the Alter Rebbe sees the world is very different than our own. Because if the Alter Rebbe was writing from a perspective of human experience, chapters 6, 7, and 8 would be 10 times as long as chapters 2 through 5, right? In other words, if we want, sometimes we feel like we, in other words, the way I phrased it the first time we made this point, is that sometimes we feel that the Alter Rebbe and the Tanya does not relate to our experience. And the reason we feel this way is because a large amount of what the Alter Rebbe is talking about is really in our regular lives a very small percentage of experience. Whereas a very large amount of what we experience in our day-to-day lives is contained in very few words by the Alter Rebbe. In other words, it's like the Hayom Yom says, right? Chassidus shows us how low we are and how high we can become, right? In other words, the Alter Rebbe spends a lot of time talking about how high we can become, right, which in contrast with where we are should show us that there's lots of work we have to do. But in our natural experience, before we do any of the work that the Alter Rebbe is going to talk about, right, when we're in these early chapters and the Alter Rebbe, the Tanya, is building up an entire worldview from scratch, starting with two souls, right, it turns out that a lot of what we experience, and this is by no accident, a lot of what we experience, a lot of what we might do, a lot of what we might go through in life, really is all on one side of the equation. The Alter Rebbe's division of things into holy and not, a third way of saying this, the Alter Rebbe's division of holiness and the non-holy, right, is not a division in our experience that's 50-50. In other words, a decently good person who's living a decently good life, they're not terrible, they're not great, they're just the average person who is most people by definition, right? They are not living a life that is half good and half bad, or even close, in the Alter Rebbe's definition of these things. In fact, if you'll remember in chapter 1, the whole idea that a Beinoni, an intermediate person, is half good and half bad, we rejected for like 12 different reasons why that can't be the true meaning of the term Beinoni. And this is reflected in the Alter Rebbe's whole worldview. This is the book for the intermediate man, but the Alter Rebbe's intermediate man is not the description of the average person. The two are not related. In fact, the Alter Rebbe's intermediate man is far beyond, is in the vanishingly small, highest percentages of mankind. And all the more so, the Alter Rebbe's understanding of the tzaddik, who is even more vanishingly rare, even more unusual. Most of our lives of the average person are lived in the realms we are going to discuss in these chapters. So, in other words, the distinction between what we commonly call a good person and a bad person, a good person and a good life and a bad life, a generally okay moral existence and a depraved, terrible existence. To the Alter Rebbe, almost all of this goes in the category of the Klippa and the Sitra Achra. Almost none of this has anything to do with holiness as the Alter Rebbe understands it. And yet, in the Alter Rebbe's chapters, they each get the same number of chapters, right? Do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, this is another way in which the Alter Rebbe is fundamentally shifting our worldview. The Alter Rebbe is saying that all of that diversity and the rich existence that can be had in Klippa and Sitra Achra, in the alienation of God from the world, all of which we'll define in the coming classes when Alter Rebbe gets to the definitions of these terms, this is all the vast majority of our experience, and this is all having to do with only one of the two souls in Jewish life. Yes? In chapter 1, we said fundamentally, what is the Nefesh HaBahamis? We said it's the first soul in Israel, right? The second soul begins chapter 2 with the famous words that the Nefesh HaShenis B'Yisrael Chelek Elikam Imal Mamish. That's how the second chapter starts. The first soul, which we describe in the first chapter, is derived from Klippa and Sitra Achra. Klippa means the shell or the peel, the shell realities that we discussed in chapter 1. Sitra Achra means the other side. We have finally, I gave you an IOU back in chapter 1 last year and said that one day we will discuss the difference between these two things. That day is rapidly approaching, perhaps next week's class. The Klippa versus the Klippa and the Sitra Achra. What this basically means is God creates things that are in denial of the reality of God. And again, given my whole spiel that I just gave you 3 seconds ago, the way in which these things deny God is not in the normal way we would typically assume, where someone, let's say, would say, I deny God. That is not the Alter Rebbe's standard of denying God. This is a form of existential alienation and denial of God. Or in other words, the very existence of these things, no matter what they happen to be doing, or how the thing that they are doing may appeal or not appeal to our taste or common sense of logic or morality or rationality or what have you, by their very existence, they deny the reality of God. That's why we say God creates things that deny him, rather than things choose to deny him on their own, or their valence or their taste or their quality denies God, right? God creates them, so to speak, from the very inception, the very core of their being. They are created in denial of God. That is the nature of their creation, the core of their being. When we learned chapter 1, we called this I am, right? Which we associated with klippas nega. We said the three impure klippas, and we'll get back to this distinction probably again in next week's class, but it's either I am or only I. There's different levels of denial of God, but fundamentally the existential idea, the fact that a thing zokt, the fact that a thing says, so to speak, in its very being, I exist, is the denial of God. The Jewish animal soul comes from, naturally, klippas nega, which is the intermediate level. As we're going to discuss in these chapters, there's what's called the three impure klippas, which are totally evil, quote unquote, although as we said it in chapter 1 and we'll say it again when we get to the appropriate place, we don't believe anything is totally evil. It all depends what you mean, but relatively speaking, are totally evil. That's the lowest things which deny God, right? For example, a sin or a transgression going against the will of God is in the three impure klippas. An idolater, their soul comes from the three impure klippas. Then you have a middle level. To me personally, the middle level is the most interesting. The Tanya's understanding of reality and our intuitive understanding of reality actually have some overlap. And that is in the place of the klippas nega, which means the translucent klippa. We mean translucent, it lets some light through. That's what we mean by translucent. If the three impure klippas are opaque, right, they're not see-through, light can't get through, the middle klippa, the klippas nega, is the translucent klippa. It lets some light through. There's some good in the klippas nega. Some small percentage of the klippas nega lets some light through. We defined the klippas nega as, and therefore the nefesh habahamis, which comes from the klippas nega, which derives from the klippas nega, the translucent shell, the translucent covering of God, we defined it as I am, right? And we pointed out in chapter 1 that the reason why I translated as I am is because I am could be taken in any direction. You could say, I am the only God, you could say about yourself. Or you could say, I am a servant of God, about yourself. I am is a neutral statement, right? Once you get to the three impure klippas, it's more like only I. Then there's no room for this neutrality, right? Klippas nega is interesting, and as we're going to see, it's the realm of the dvarim hamutarim, the things that are permitted, or in other words, neutral, right? This neutral realm, quote unquote, which is still called the klippa, something that we'll have to understand more as we go forward. It's still called something that denies God, even though it's neutral. Both are true. It is in one sense neutral, and in another sense, it is inherently in denial of Hashem. But this realm could go either way. It could say, I am a servant of God. It could say, I am not. In other words, it could have a certain sense of bittul even. I am not. I do not exist, right? But all of what it says starts with I am. It's given a self, right, around which all things revolve. The godly soul, by contrast, as we said back when we were doing chapter 1 and chapter 2, the godly soul is the divine I am. It's God saying I am, right? In as the soul of the Jew. The Jew is a statement of God saying I am, which means that never the twain shall meet. No matter what a created I am ever says, it will never be God saying I am, which is why the two are irreconcilable, right? There's no such thing as something that it's existentially klippas nega. No matter how good you get, even if you say, I am a philanthropist who helps little old ladies cross the street, which is wonderful, and klippas nega says that all the time, it never becomes God saying I am. You understand? It's categorically, it's like a cat becoming a dog. It's two fundamentally different things. It's not a spectrum, right? Klippas nega and the shalish klippas is more of a spectrum, which is interesting. They're both called klippas, so that's interesting. As we'll see, the realm of the neutral and the realm of the evil and forbidden is more of a spectrum, which is where you get the diversity of most of human life, is lived in this spectrum, right? Whereas holiness comes only from God in Chassidus. In other words, you don't have holiness without God. There's no self-attained holiness, so to speak. Holiness is commensurate with God. God is something other than the creation in Judaism 101. And therefore, the creation is never God saying, I am. The creation is never on its own terms, so to speak, unless it's holy, of course, unless God declares it to be within that realm, right? But on its own terms, starting from the assumption of I exist, you don't get to holiness that way. Yeah? We said all this in chapter 1. This should sound something like review. That's why Klippas Nega is inherently this is the sense in which even the animal soul is inherently a denial of God, no matter how good it gets. Because if all that's real in the divine reality is God saying I am, if only God is real, right? Then just by saying I am, even if you're the best I am, even if you're the most refined I am, there's still some kind of denial of Hashem taking place, because where before there was only one I, now there's two, right? Now there's another perspective, yes? This is the animal soul. This animal soul is God creates a separate I from himself, right? That becomes the soul of the Jew. In chapter 1, we explained that this soul is the natural biological soul of the person. In other words, it is the soul which is united with the body. And we had a whole discussion about how in Chassidus the physical isn't purely physical, right? The physical is part spiritual and the spiritual is part physical, and in the body they unite, right? The most edel part of the body, the heat in the blood, is the vessel for the most physical, so to speak, part of the soul, and the two are united there in the body. And the animal soul is what vivifies the body. In other words, it's the soul which is what makes the difference between a person being a corpse, so to speak, and a person being a living person. The difference is the animal soul. The animal soul is the one that is our biological life, right? Which makes sense because all biological life is naturally self-centered. Not that there's anything wrong with being self-centered in its own way. We also said in chapter 1, this may pertain to what we're going to say later in tonight's class, God willing, that the chapter 1 ends with a discussion of how the animal soul is made up of the four elements, the four spiritual elements, which give the animal soul its emotive qualities, right? We say that the arrogance of the animal soul comes from fire, right? And the anger as well comes from fire, whereas water is the source of all the taivas, of all lusts and desires, right? And we also said that the animal soul of the Jew is the source of all of their natural good traits as well. When the Gemara says that a Jew is a rachman, a baishan, and is gomel chasadim, right? That's the fact that a Jew is naturally, all else being equal, merciful, baishan, he's shy, right? Demure, and he's giving, right? All of that comes from the animal soul as well, because that's the natural traits, the natural biological traits, which was the Alter Rebbe showing us even in chapter 1, that the Klippas Nega has good as well, right? Good in the sense of moral good. Even though it's existentially denying God by existing, nevertheless, it could still be a good guy and have good character traits, right? Because being a good guy and being good in the divine sense are two different things in the teachings of Alter Rebbe, right? Over the next 3 chapters, we're going to explain all of this much more, God willing. That's the goal. We're going to elaborate on the animal soul, the nature of Klippa and Sitra Achra, and all of the things that the soul gets up to that is not directed towards God. Because again, the easiest mnemonic, the easiest way to remember the difference between the neshamas is that the godly soul, the holy soul, the soul of Kedusha, is directed only towards God, right? The Nefesh Elokis, the godly soul, only has an interest in God. Its seichel and midos, good evening, its intellect, its emotions, its levushim, its thought, speech, and action, God, then it's the other option. There's only two options. There's being about God, and then there's the other option, right, which encompasses, again, all of the breadth and depth and richness. Other option. There is, to a certain extent, a certain binary nature to it, although, as we're going to see, there's a binary within the binaries. Really, in a way, it's trinary, because the Klippas Nega versus the Shalosh Klippas Atameus is the distinction, and really that's the distinction between being a good person and a bad person, so to speak, but it's all within Klippa, right? As we will see, and maybe we'll meet our good old friend who we discussed once upon a time, the Nefesh HaSichlis, the third soul, the intellectual soul of the Jew, which is the unstated secret to understanding all of this. It's really about understanding how Tanya can be reconciled with our regular understanding of reality. If anyone's interested in such a crazy thing,
look at the first sentence. It says here, it doesn't start with Nefesh HaBehemi.
Yeah.
Nefesh HaChiyunit, it tames it a little bit.
I don't think even in chapter 1, if I recall correctly, I may be mistaken, he may not have even called it the Nefesh HaBahamis in chapter 1. I think he called it the Nefesh HaTivis or the Nefesh HaChiyunis. The vital, the natural, and the animal soul are all, roughly speaking, the same thing. Yeah. Okay, let's start chapter 6. Chapter 6 of the Holy Tanya, Tanya Kadisha, Zok the Heilige Alter Rebbe, Zok the Heilige Tanya, the Holy Alter Rebbe, and the Holy Tanya says, B'Lashenei Azav, with his golden tongue, Perek Vav, chapter 6. We are hurtling through the Tanya at this rate. I don't know if we even have time to smell the roses. We're going so fast. Says the Holy Tanya, Vehine, behold, Zeh le'umas zeh asa Elokim. God has made one thing opposite the other. This one juxtaposed with this one did God make. This is a quote from Koheles, Ecclesiastes, chapter 7, verse 14. Ecclesiastes. Diagonesh, don't worry, just say Koheles. We know what you mean. In English, Koheles, in Hebrew, Kohelet, and in some other language, Ecclesiastes. This phrase in Chassidus, the pasuk, means that God makes good things and bad things, and they all come from God. That's what the pshat of the verse means in Koheles. Right? Good has its reward, and evil has its consequences, right? And basically, God has made things, so to speak, parallel one to each other, right? God has made, interestingly, God has made a dualism, is really what you would say, which is interesting, right? The one God made things half and half. He made a dualism. He made one thing opposite another thing. He split it down the middle, right? Really, we see this where's the first time we hear about God making a dualism? Very good. Right?
No?
Yeah. No, you're right. You're shocked. You're shocked that you're right. Absolutely, right. It doesn't take very long. Immediately upon creating, God is splitting things one from the other. The truth is you could really argue Bereshis bara Elokim as Hashemayim v'Haaretz, as even before. And in fact, you could even say that bara Elokim is itself even, right? Basically, as soon as you start to speak, you start making dichotomies, right? That's the lesson. Right, V'yavdal is the official, but what I'm saying is even before the official, you have already, right? You have already half and half distinctions, which is interesting.
Well, the separation from Elohim and Hashem. This is the first separation.
Well, that's just implicit, but how do you know there's even both in the first pasuk? Anyway, well, it all depends how you're You read B'derech HaSod, we know this, right? You read in the Sod, not in the Pshat. This one juxtaposed to this one did God make. In Chassidus, this is the verse by which we refer to the Klippa and the Sitra Achra. There is a shadow government, a parallel reality, parallel dimension, right? Where everything, insert asterisk, it's not actually everything, but a lot of things, almost everything which God makes in holiness, there is a version of it in unholiness, in Klippa and Sitra Achra. In other words, God makes, there is a certain sense, and you have to not get carried away with this because it's an extremely limited sense. It's not this isn't like a golden rule that you can apply wherever. It doesn't work like that. But in a certain sense, God makes everything balanced between good and evil, which in Chassidus means holiness and the other thing. Yeah, that's what good and evil means in Chassidus. So everything that we just explained, this is what the Alter Rebbe is using it for. We just had chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, and chapter 5 of the Holy Tanya explaining to us all the structure, all the different faculties and garments and all of these interesting things that exist in the godly soul. We are now learning that the animal soul is created with the same structure. The animal soul, that's what Alter Rebbe means by this pasuk, as we're about to elaborate, is created with the exact same structure. In other words, the godly soul has 10 faculties. We're going to say the animal soul has 10 faculties. The godly soul has 3 garments. The animal soul has 3 garments. We already said, we're going to say also that we already had chapter 1 and chapter 2, which were parallel, right? So now we're extending that parallel, and we're explaining it with the animal soul. What's interesting is that what did we always say when we were going through the chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5? We were saying that you start with the root of the godly soul, which is really how God sees it as he creates it. And then when you get to the faculties, that's the finite or the defined way that the Nefesh Elokis exists in the world, so to speak, right? As an existing thing rather than in its godly source, right? So the same is true with the Nefesh HaBahamis. Chapter 1 was about the core, the essence of the animal soul, which is I am, which is Klippas Nega, which we're going to explain more in the coming chapters. Now we're again expanding on that idea that the essence of the animal soul then comes into finitude and definition, right, in the following ways. And as you'll see, what's interesting is that as the Alter Rebbe goes through, even here, we're at the beginning of this chapter, he's going to go through in very, very few words the parallels. The Alter Rebbe is already going to say differences, right? It's not, in other words, even in this thing that we're saying is parallel, which is not generalizable to anything else. You can't say Zelu Umazeh. You can't say Kedusha always has a parallel in Klippa whenever you want. But even here in the animal soul, where we're saying it's made to be parallel, we're going to see that even here there's important differences, right? Continues the Alter Rebbe, Ki kamei sha'nefesh ha'elikis klula me'eser sviras kedushos uslaveshes b'shleish levushim kedoshim, just as the godly soul is included of 10 holy spheres and is enclosed in 3 holy garments. You'll recall, even though we called the 10 faculties of the soul koiches, not spheres, right? You will recall we called them faculties, not the divine traits, right? But you'll recall that at the beginning of chapter 3, I believe it was, when we discussed the 10 faculties of the godly soul, we explained the reason or the source, so to speak, of the 10 faculties of the godly soul come from the 10 holy spheres of Hashem, the 10 divine faculties, the 10 ways of divine manifestation. And you'll recall that the reason for this, it's not arbitrary. It's not arbitrary that just because it's 10, just because we need 10 to come from 10, it's not arbitrary at all. On the contrary, what we were explaining is that the divine, just as the divine self, which is totally transcendent, expresses itself in a defined way in 10 spheres, roughly speaking. The godly soul, it's the every self, everything that could be called a self is in Chassidus, in Kabbalah, is just constructed in the same way. So in other words, if you really are a self, like God is a self, so to speak. Obviously, no one really is like God, so there's some kind of leeway in this definition. But if you're a self, if you're an I, if you're an ich, the way that God is an I, right, then the way that an I manifests is always the same, so to speak. So the divine I manifests and becomes, so to speak, limited or more limited into the 10 divine traits. So the godly soul, whose core is being a literal piece of God, is manifest and becomes more defined in 10 holy traits, because that's it itself follows the paradigm and the pattern and is derived from the divine self. So to the Nefesh HaBahamis, the animal soul, the self of Klippa, also has a source. Creed is in the 10 impure Klippas, right? In other words, the 10, it also has a source, as we're going to say. No, not the Shalosh Klippas Atameas, it's something else. Sorry, the 10 impure crowns of Klippa, as we're going to explain. So the structure of the godly soul is power, which derives from the structure of the divine self. You have the transcendent God who expresses in 10 spheres. You have the transcendent godly soul who expresses in 10 holy faculties, right? And 3 holy garments. So you're going to have the animal soul, which derives from all of these things in Klippa, the version of these things in Klippa. What's Klippa? What do we mean by the soul reality? The Alter Rebbe is only going to explain that after we get through the summary of the way the animal soul parallels. So in other words, if your question is, what do we mean by Klippa and Sitra Achra, we'll do that in the coming classes, okay? But there's a, as we already defined it, there's a divine reality that is alienated from itself, that denies godliness, right? And this is the source of the animal soul. Kach, continues the Alter Rebbe, Kach hanefesh de Sitra Achra miklipas nega. So too is the soul of Sitra Achra, so too is the soul which derives from the other side, miklipas nega, and it comes from the translucent shell, the translucent klipa, hameluveshas bedam ha'adam, which is enclosed in the blood of man. So now we know exactly what we're talking about, because we mentioned all of this back in chapter 1. So too is it, kolula me'eser kisrin de misavusa. So too is it made up of, or comprised of, the 10 crowns of impurity, is how it's translated here. Misavusa is, this is an Aramaic phrase. The Eser Kisrin de Misavusa, the 10 crowns of impurity. You'll note here, for Ronnie, who is our close reader of the Alter Rebbe's golden tongue, that he said, where does it come from? Miklipos nega, in plural, right? See what I mean?
Yeah.
Klipos noga, from the multiple noga klipos. The book that I used to prepare this class said that we don't know why it says that. It may be an error, or an old error. You have to go to a higher dollar class than ours to get the answer to that one. You have to pay more for that one. Okay. The godly soul derives from the divine self. The animal soul derives from 10 impure crowns. These are the things that parallel the 10 holy spheres, right? So in other words, so to speak, God creates 10 divine traits, so to speak, that are not holy. Which means that there's something like the 10 divine traits which exist in the world of Atzilus, but that are in denial of themselves. They're in denial of God somehow. This is a juicy topic. The first question is, why are they called crowns? From there we get to all the that's like the surface of the cholent, and then from there we get.
Even bad kings are being coronated.
Say again?
Even bad kings are being coronated.
Even bad kings are being coronated. That's a good point, but it's cheating, because since we don't know what the word spheris means, right? If we knew what spheris means, maybe we'd say even bad kings get spheris as well. The Alter Rebbe writes, we have two, I'll give you two Pirushim. One is from the Alter Rebbe in Torah, from Alter Rebbe elsewhere, and one is the Rebbe's father, who wrote a very intense Kabbalistic commentary
I think each one correct himself.
on Tanya. It's a very nice idea. It's a very nice idea. You'd have to explain why, how come only one of the 10 spheres is called Malchus, it's called kingship.
Right, but in Olam HaNekudim,
Thinking of Olam HaNekudim.
which will correct himself.
Getting there. Chaim. Good job, Ronnie. What? I would love if he read ahead. On the contrary, that was someone. Right, if Ronnie read ahead, that would show more interest in the class, maybe than would show some interest in the class. It's very exciting. The first reason the Alter Rebbe says, why are they called the 10 impure crowns? They're called the 10 impure crowns because the crown, the source of godliness, is makif on the, a crown is makif on the head. Let's start over with that sentence. I was distracted. Makif, the crown, the order of holiness, right? The order of the 10 spheres, consider the 10 spheres, moving away from whatever the words 10 spheres means, which we don't know what they mean anyways, it doesn't matter. Moving away from that term that we don't know what it means. Think of, there's a whole divine order. We call it the Olam HaTikun, right? Which means the world of order, right? This is connected with the actual definition of the term Tikkun Olam, rather than the Save the Whales definition. Hi. The divine order, where everything is in its right place, everything being in its right place in the Jewish definition, means that everything knows its relationship to God. That's really what it means. Everything is in its right place. Order, that's what the word order means, everything in its right place. Order is a neutral term, right? It's just when you just say order, right? A Jewish order, an order as God intends it, right, is an order where everything knows its correct relationship to God. Everything is in its right place. Yeah? Vis-a-vis the divine, vis-a-vis holiness. The divine order in Judaism and Kabbalah begins with chachma, begins with wisdom, as we normally translate it. As I've said before in this class, the normal translations are inadequate to the definition of the spheres for various reasons. Okay, I'm just trying to figure out what order to explain this in. So the realm of order begins with chachma. Chachma is a form of intellect, for lack of better translation. What's intellect? This is what we explained back in how we had 2 thorough classes on the definition of the 10 different faculties of the soul back in chapter 3, which are really foundational, not surprisingly. Chachma in Chassidus, in Tanya, as we're going to see, Chachma really means bittul. Chachma really means the soul has a unique ability, which is its highest ability, to step aside and allow the truth to come in, right? In other words, to become nothing and to allow reality to enter. Or as it's sometimes called in Chassidus, it's called re'iyah. It's called seeing. Chachma is re'iyah. Chachma is seeing, right? You see the truth. What do you mean when you see the truth? You mean when I'm seeing something right now and I see this yellow coffee cup, I see it as it is. I don't get involved, so to speak, even though in truth, if you really dig into it, we are involved in the act of seeing, and Chassidus would agree. So that's a topic for a different time. But at the basic level, right, this thing is here, the light enters my eyes, I see it as it is, I see it as it's standing here. I don't have to construct this thing, right? Bina, which is the next sphere, is analysis. That's when I say, What shade of yellow is this? Does it match a shade that's at Sherwin-Williams? Why are things yellow? How are they yellow? What molecular structure makes them yellow? Then maybe they shouldn't even be called yellow if I'm a pedantic nerd, because I say it only reflects the color yellow according to our theory of light, rather than actually being yellow. There's all sorts of things I could say about my yellow coffee cup, right? How is it able to keep liquid so hot for so long? Chachma is you see the thing. The thing in its wholeness is present, right? It's a form of bittul. Keser in Kabbalah and Chassidus, the crown, it's called the crown because it sits on top of the head. That's why it's called the crown. It's called the crown. It's one of the reasons it's called the crown. One of the reasons it's called the crown is because it sits on top of the head. What do we mean by this? We mean that the recognition of God is not within the order. The recognition of God is beyond the order, right? Or in other words, the 10 impure crowns are called crowns because of the thing that we said in our review and we said back in chapter 1. They are alienated from the reality of God. God makes something that is in denial of its own relationship with God. That's the definition of klipa, and most things that we know and understand and love in the world, right, are in denial of their relationship with God, right? Most things say, I exist, and that definition the definition of that existence does not require God. Even if someone gets a little smarter and realizes that they need God, right, their definition is, I exist, and that existence, which is most prior and most axiomatic and most real, right, the thing that is most real in the world, which is myself, can be turned towards God. And for most people, that's the greatest possible achievement, right? That's what we're hoping for, ideally, right? And yet, what does it start with? It starts with, I exist, inescapable. There's an inescapable fundamental reality that I am. That's why we keep calling the klipa I am. God creates an I am, which means that when the I am recognizes God, right? When the I am is in its most honest state, how does it recognize it? It recognizes it as somewhere else. Because what I am as my core is not God, right? God is something out there. I am here. God also is out there. That's how Klippa recognizes God, right? And therefore, they're called the 10 crowns, because the crown means it's the recognition of God as somewhere above, right, rather than within. That's why it's called the crown. That's the Alter Rebbe's explanation of why it's called the crown. They're called the 10 crowns of impurity, because in impurity, their bittul is never united with them, which is a different way of saying my recognition of God is always out there. But in here, I am. That's the core. The core is I am. Now, I am could be I am the nicest person in the world, but my recognition of God is still out there, right? And that's why Klippa is referred to as a crown. There is an interrelated, it's not really a different explanation, it's just an extension or a fleshing out of this explanation given by the Rebbe's father in his Kabbalistic commentary on the Tanya, which I'd highly recommend reading just to see what it's like. It's not easy reading material. Yeah.
It's terrible.
It's terrible as well. What Ronnie means by it's terrible is it's wonderful but very difficult to understand.
It's impossible to understand.
I am translating it for him. The Rebbe's father says that they're called crowns because the crown of every sphera is in the world of Tohu, which is what Ronnie was referring to by each sphera crowns itself, right? This is really, so we said earlier, if you recall, before we started talking about crowns, that just as the 10 faculties of the godly soul have a source in the divine self, so too the 10 faculties of the animal soul have a source in the divine self. Now we are giving a name to the source of the 10 faculties of the animal soul, the 10 faculties of Klippa and the divine self. They're called the world of Tohu, which means the world of chaos. It's called the world of chaos because in the divine order, everything recognizes its relationship with God. And that order starts with Chachma, the world of Tikkun. In Kabbalistic language, we would say all the 4 worlds in the regular Seder Shtalshalos, as we describe it, the world chain, starting from the world of Atzilus and coming down, that's the order of Tikkun, right? Starting with Chachma. Chachma is its highest principle, right? But Keser, this idea of the crown, is also a level in godliness. And this level, in this case, in particular, this level or this aspect of the divine self is called the world of Tehu, the world of chaos. Now, the relationship between these two things is a very rich subject. In fact, one of the Rebbe's most famous and celebrated Maimarim, which is called Mayim Rabim, the Many Waters, is about the distinction between the world of Tikkun and the world of Tehu. It's very profound. It's very rich. But the back of the postcard version is that Tehu is the original source of I am, right? Now you would say, how does I am start in holiness, in godliness, right? Because I am, like we said before, is a denial of God, right? How does it start? Well, the Kabbalistic story of how it begins, the roots of I am, as it were, right, is that first there's the divine self, there's the true I am, there's God himself, where I am is a true statement. Then God brings forth 10 spheres, 10 aspects of the divine, or a different way of putting it is God steps into being a defined existence, right? But the first defined existence that God makes is, so to speak, unsustainable now, and it breaks. There's something called Shviras HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. This unsustainability is totally on purpose. In other words, it's not like God didn't know the result of the experiment and he tried it and he said, oh shoot, it broke. Let me make it better. That's not how it worked. That's not what happened. This is on purpose. God makes an unsustainable, which means, or a different word for unsustainable is disordered, non-tikkun, right? He makes a disordered reality. The reason for that is because God wants to bring about klipas and sitra achra, right? In other words, the reason God made, and why does he bring about klipas and sitra achra? Because he wants to do it b'tachtonim, right? It all follows through. God wants a dwelling place in the lowest. The lowest involves creating things that deny him. In order to create things that deny him, there has to be a root in godliness for the denial of God, which is a strange concept. How can there be a root in godliness for the denial of God? It's very simple. If God takes his sense of self, so to speak, the divine I am, and he manifests it as an existing self, as a self that exists the way this coffee cup exists, right? It's unsustainable, because nothing that is finite or defined in any way can withstand being an I am like God. And the way this is explained in the Kabbalah is that each of the 10 spheres, each of the divine traits, felt that it was the pure manifestation of God. In other words, the divine Chesed said, God is Chesed. The divine Gvura says God is Gvura. And because they were each pure in their manifestation, each felt that they were God. In other words, they had no bittul, right? It was unsustainable. This realm, which is where each sphera has its beginning. Chesed, the divine kindness, where does it begin in Tehu, right? And the highest level of Chesed, of the divine kindness, is called Keser de Chesed. Right? The crown of Chesed. And what's the world where all the crowns are gathered together? The world of Tehu. That's what the Rebbe's father explains, right? So in other words, he's saying in Kabbalistic language, I don't know if everyone followed that. If you didn't, it's okay. The Rebbe's father explains in Kabbalistic language that the reason it's called the 10 impure crowns is because the source of Klippa is in the world of Tehu. The source of something thinking it's an I am separate from Hashem, that all begins in this initial divine reality, this 10 impure crowns, which is the world of Tehu, right? Now, just a note in case anyone really did follow and is now confused because they followed. This is why it's better not to follow, right? Then you don't have to be confused. That's why it's better not to even come. Coming is the first mistake.
There are people who just said.
Can I repeat what I just said? If you were following, you may have the question that we said the world of Tehu is the divine I am. But earlier in the class, we said that the godly soul is the divine I am, right? It's God saying I am. What's the difference? The difference is that the godly soul is the divine I am in a way of bittul. That's the answer. The answer is that there's two ways you can be the divine I am. You can be a divine I am God, which is the utter denial that God is what?
How can you be divine?
But you have to be in denial of what you are. There has to be a fundamental disconnect within yourself. Thank you, as to how this really works, right? But when God manifests the divine chesed in the world of Tohu, right, the divine kindness, God's own traits, each one feels that it is God, right? Each one feels I am with the full strength of the divine I am, right? Now there is a way to be the divine I am with the full strength of the divine I am. It's called being nothing. If you're nothing, right? If you have complete bittul, if you're batul b'mitzias, then you can be the divine I am. You can, if you're totally nullified, right? As the godly soul is. The godly soul is God saying I am. It's aware that it's an expression of the divine. Whereas Tohu doesn't think it's an expression. It takes the whole mantle on itself, right? That each sphera believes and is given, believes not falsely, because God makes it that way, obviously, right? Believes that I am with the full I am of God, right? So in other words, it's I know that I am a divine expression of I am, really, right? It's a form of bittul, but the truth is that the godly soul is not just an expression, it's actually a piece of God, whatever that means. So actually the question reverts, and you have to study more to really answer the question. The question is a deep question. What's the difference between the divine I am of Tohu and the divine I am of the godly soul? It's a fundamental difference. If anyone's really curious, we could speak about it a little more, or we could move on. Rare choice. More? We have one vote for more. We have one vote for no. This is like appointing a speaker in the House. That's why this class should be run like a benevolent dictatorship, as usual. Not a democracy. Vohu, I have no idea. Good question. I have no idea. I don't know what Vohu is.
Does anything come from that?
I'm sure it does. I don't know. I don't know. The Alter Rebbe has the Ar Rebbe has a mimer, a fascinating mimer, where the Rebbe goes and he explains all the levels of the animal soul and the godly soul, and he goes higher and higher and higher until he gets to the very core of the godly soul, which is one with God, the Yechidah Shebenefesh. And he says even the Yechidah Shebenefesh has a parallel in the animal soul. It's interesting, no? Even the deepest level of the godly soul, which is totally one with God, has a parallel in the animal soul. In other words, the animal soul is constructed in parallel to the fifth level of the soul. To the fifth and deepest level of the soul, the Nefesh HaBahamis has a parallel. It has something like it. He says, what's the difference between the Yechidah of the animal soul? He doesn't call it that. That's not what it's called. I'm saying it parallels the Yechidah in the godly soul. The essence of the soul, the Pintele Yid. What's the difference between the core of the animal soul and the core of the godly soul? It's very simple. He says at the core of both is a ratzon, is a want. This already implies a form of bittul, by the way, maybe. But at the core of both of them is a want. The godly soul wants God. And the animal soul wants whatever it wants. That's the fundamental difference. At the very, very deepest level, the godly soul wants God. The animal soul can want anything. It doesn't have to want God. It can want whatever it wants. In other words, its want is directionless. It wants whatever it wants, and each person's animal soul, I believe, has a different want, or the want can change over time. It's not a want that's directed only to God. And this, at the core, is the fundamental difference. That's the final distinguishing factor between the godly soul and the animal soul. What does this mean, in my humble opinion? In my humble opinion, what this means is that the godly soul is defined by the object of its want. The animal soul is ultimately defined by itself, right? The godly soul is defined externally, right? It wants something whose definition is external to itself, right? It wants fundamentally, right, its creator. it's inherently desiring of its creator. It's the awareness of its creator as a reality, as a truth, is something that it wants inherently, right? The animal soul's want is directionless, which means what? Which means that its want is a self-defined want, right? In a way, it actually sounds more. In a way, and you have to be always careful with these things. In a way, intuitively, it actually sounds like they're backwards in a sense, right? Because you would think the godly soul, maybe, I'm not going to get into that. It's just going to make you more confused. What? Of course, there's Tanug, but the Alter Rebbe explains it as at the core, there's a Ratzon. That's this mimer. When the Rebbe is explaining this, the Rebbe explains it as a Ratzon. I don't know how Tanug fits into this. I don't even know the difference between Tanug and Ratzon.
No, the reason I said it is because whatever gives pleasure to the understanding is the Tanugot Achari. It's different Tanug.
Well, why not the godly soul? Then God gives it its Tanug. So in other words, it's the same thing, in other words. You're saying it's the same thing in different words. The animal soul, why is this connected to the difference between Tehu and the Nefesh Elokis? This is pure speculation now, but Kiel asked for it. So the difference between the animal soul, the I am, the divine I am that's in the world of Tehu, and the divine I am that's in the godly soul, right? The fundamental difference is that the I am of the godly soul is an I am that is externally defined fundamentally. It's fundamentally externally defined. Whereas in the world of Tehu, the I am is actually one with the thing, right? In other words, the I am is what it wants what it wants is self-defined. What it wants comes from inside. Whereas the godly soul at the fundamental level is aware of the divine. It wants God. God is a reality to it at the most fundamental level. Whereas the divine I am in the world of Tehu, it's I am, and now that will attach itself to whatever. Whereas, I didn't mean to confuse you more, but you see, you managed to confuse yourself. You didn't need my help. Okay. That was for the people who want to be confused. Let's go back now. We're to learning Tanya. We're a little over time, but class started late, so. The bottom line is, it's called crowns. The nefesh habahamis, the animal soul, is defined by separation from God. That's the definition of the animal soul. The animal soul derives from the 10 impure crowns. What this means is that the animal soul is separation from God by definition. That's really what it means. What are the 10 impure crowns? Shehain, continues the Alter Rebbe, Shehain, Sheva Midos Rois, they are the 7 negative emotive traits, Habos, Ma'arbi Yisaides Roim Hanal, which come from the four negative elements, spiritual elements we mentioned earlier in chapter 1. The Seichel HaMoilidon, and the mind that gives birth to them. Hanechlak l'shalosh, which is separated into 3 parts, Shem Chachma, Bina, V'das, which are Chachma, Bina, and Das, Makar HaMidos, the source of the emotions, Ki HaMidos hein l'fi arach HaSeichel, because the emotions are commensurate to the intellect, or according to the measure of the intellect. Now here we have a very interesting statement. At the surface level, read superficially, the Alter Rebbe is simply saying that the 10 faculties of the animal soul parallel the 10 faculties of the godly soul. Now the animal soul also has Chachma, and I just said before that Chachma is the trait of Tikkun, and it's not really the trait of Tehu, so that's also another thing you can be confused about. The truth is, it's not so straightforward because Tikkun is defined by Chachma, whereas Tehu is not, even though they both have Chachma. Number one, there's important differences here. For a person who's reading deeper, there's fundamental distinction between the godly soul and the animal soul is explained here. What I said before is from the Mimer of the Rebbe explaining the difference at the deepest place, right? Here you have much more practically what's the difference, right? Much more practically, what's the difference between the godly soul and the animal soul? In chapter 3, we said that seichel is the source of midos. Seichel, in the intellect, gives birth to the emotions, and the emotions are called toldas Chabad, right? Are called the children of Chachma, Bina, and Das. In chapter 3, when we're talking about the godly soul, we also first discussed seichel, and then we discussed midos. We first discussed the intellect, and then we discussed the emotions. Here, the order is reversed. Alter Rebbe says there's 7 emotions and 3 intellectual aspects, if you'll notice. And furthermore, he says, why are the emotions in what sense are the emotions, in what sense is the intellect the source of the emotions? Because the emotions are commensurate to the intellect, not because the emotions are born of the intellect. In chapter 3, when we're talking about the godly soul, we say literally the emotions are born from the intellect. They're toldas Chabad. They're the children of Chachma, Bina, and Das. Here, we say that they are, why is intellect their source? Because they're commensurate, or they're measured according to the intellect. This is a fundamental distinction that we actually mentioned earlier, I think, when we were learning chapter 3. Now, the Alter Rebbe is saying it explicitly. The nefesh elokis, the godly soul, is primarily intellectual. The animal soul is primarily emotive. The fundamental difference between the two of them. The godly soul is fundamentally intellectual. The animal soul is fundamentally emotive. And yet both of them have both. So it's a subtle thing. It's not just that whenever I feel emotions, it's the animal soul. Whenever I think something, it's the godly soul. No. Not even close. Not even close. However, primarily, who's in the driver's seat, you would say? In the godly soul, the intellect is in the driver's seat. In the animal soul, the emotions are in the driver's seat. In other words, in the godly soul, very briefly, to review what we discussed in chapter 3, in the godly soul, you have a knowledge of God, a direct knowledge of God, which comes from something you would sometimes call emunah, which is faith, which is an infinite knowledge of God. You know God because you're a piece of God, and there's no explanation of it. You just know it because that's who you are. This is how the godly soul works. That knowledge, a piece of that knowledge, a piece of the way that you know the truth of God in this lofty and transcendent sense, comes into chachma. It comes into what's called wisdom. This is then analyzed in understanding and internalized and made real in what's called knowledge. This is Chachma, Bina, and Das. And the function of the intellect is what? The function of the intellect is to instantiate, is to make real, is to give defined form to the soul's inherent connection to God. That's what the intellect is for in the godly soul. Right? It's not to be able to think things. The godly soul has no interest in thinking things per se. It has an interest in thinking about God. Right? This goes back to what we said just a minute ago. And then once the intellect internalizes through Das that reality of God in an act of deep contemplation, right, in which that reality of God is brought down into a 3-dimensional, fully fleshed reality for the person, right? This gives birth to the emotions. What's the emotions? The emotions are the fundamental shape of the soul, the measure of the soul, the midos, in the sense of the soul has things that it fits with and wants to move towards, and things that it doesn't fit and want to move away from. Or in other words, it has love and fear of God. That's how we describe the intellect and the emotions in chapter 3. Everything in this system comes through the intellect. In other words, the godly soul, except for exceptions that we'll talk about later in Tanya, like in chapter 18, right? The emotions of the godly soul are always preceded by intellectual contemplation. There is no natural emotional excitability of the godly soul. In other words, the contours of the godly soul are all based in truth and actual connection to the object of the emotion, right? The godly soul doesn't love something unless it has had a real spiritual connection with that thing. That connection has been brought down and made fully fleshed through the intellect, and now it has an emotional connection with that thing. Its love of God comes through an act of contemplation. In other words, in the godly soul, there's no free pass. There's no such thing as, I saw a photo of a rabbi and I was inspired, right? That's not how it works. That's not how it works. Because the godly soul, everything derives from its real connection with God. In other words, it's all real. All emotion is based on an objective dveikus, an objective connection to God that happens through emunah and then in seichel and comes down through the soul. In other words, and this is a side point but an important one, the idea that we always say, and we're going to say later in Tanya, about many different things, that you have to contemplate godliness, is not just for the benefit of the animal soul. In other words, the fact that you have to sit and think about God and really understand it and really think about it to have any sort of feeling would be true even if you had no animal soul. Because that's the way the godly soul works. The godly soul only has feelings from a genuine connection, right? Think again what we said before. The idea that I am here and God is like something out there is a sign of klippa. That's a keser, right? That's a crown where my connection can I just sort of am connected to like things that are over there, right? The godly soul in Chassidus is pnimius, is an inner connection, which means, in other words, when the godly soul connects to God, it's always God in here, not God out there. Right? It's a different way of putting it. The real holiness is a vitality from the inside, not from the outside. Real holiness, when you have a real avas Hashem, a real love and fear of God, which can be hard to attain and maybe sounding more and more unattainable by the second, comes through an actual, genuine unity and connection. Like we said when we were learning, I believe, I forget which chapter, either chapter 3 or chapter 4, it's as objectively real as when you hug another body. Right? Theme of Teves, a guf nana min a guf. When a body embraces another body, it's as objective a fact of connection as a physical act of cleaving or connection. Right? That is what brings about emotions in the godly soul. In the animal soul, punkt verkehrt. The exact opposite, right? Intellect is by accident. Intellect is with work, right? The emotions are totally natural to the animal soul. In the regular human biological existence, emotion and emotional reaction is completely natural and completely built in, right? The example given is that when you see someone else eating good food, it makes you hungry nearly instantaneously, and you want some of that food, right? That, without any need for contemplation and deep understanding of what is food and what's the nature of food, no. It happens, yes, exactly. It happens quite naturally, quite primarily, and requires no contemplation. Its likes and dislikes, the shape of the soul, are in the driver's seat. And in fact, in other discourses, and maybe we'll discuss it a little bit later in Tanya, the intellect of the animal soul is always secondary. In other words, it always starts from the emotions. The emotions are in the driver's seat, which is why worldly philosophy and manly and human wisdom, the wisdom of humankind, is not a means to attain holiness in Chassidus, because you start with the emotions and what you already want to do, and then you can just do that for a lifetime and never actually have to encounter something else, which in this case would be God, something other than what I already want to do, right? Sorry, I know we're way over. Let's just finish reading. So let's just do a couple more lines here. It'll be very short. I'm sorry. The second point. So the second point here that we read is this is why when we talk about the emotions being the intellect being the source of the emotions in the animal soul, it just says they're lefi erech, not their children, right? In the godly soul, the emotions are the children of the intellect. If there's no parents, there's no children. There's no emotions without seichel in the godly soul. Right? In the animal soul, the emotions are doing their own thing. They're here already. There's kids running around without any children to take care of them or control them, without any parents. Where's the parents? The parents are not here. The kids are always just running around destroying the town, right? How then is the intellect the source of the emotions of the animal soul? Only in the sense that the emotions are lefi erech b'seichel, which means that the intellect generally just determines at what level the emotions operate, as the Alter Rebbe is about to explain. Continues the Alter Rebbe, ki hakatan cheshek v'oyev dvarim katanim, a child desires and loves small things, pechutei erech, that are of relatively little worth. Lefisha sichle katan, because his intellect is small and limited to comprehend things that are more precious, right? The classic example, if you ask a child, would you like me to put $10 million in your bank account or a lollipop? They'll say, who needs $10 million? Give me the lollipop, right? That is because a child has a small or immature intellect, right? The mature intellect of an adult allows them to appreciate things that are of relatively more worth. And thus, the emotions of the animal soul are also kind of connected to intellect, although even though they're running on their own steam, right? So the connection is much weaker. The emotions don't need the intellect to create it, but the intellect is sort of like an animal soul, the intellect's kind of like the slave of the emotions, but it's kind of like the intellect kind of tells the emotions what's worth going after, right? This is much more valuable than this. That's the function of the intellect. So in a way, the emotions are still affected by the intellect, because if you have a very immature intellect, then you'll appreciate much smaller pleasures. But if you have a much greater intellect, you'll appreciate much greater pleasures and also much greater fears, right, which children find ridiculous. Children find the things that adults are afraid of to be quite ridiculous. Things that are scary is like the monsters under your bed, right, whereas adults are afraid of, like, I don't know, like another COVID or the market's crashing, some abstract thing that no one understands, right? So too, so that's in, the Alter Rebbe says in Chesed they desire immature things, and then in Gevura they're miskayes, they're angry, miskatzef, and upset from minor things. V'kein be'espirus, v'shar midos. And so too in his pyrus and self-aggrandizement, which children do in a very childish way, right? I'm better than you because my father is a fire truck or whatever, right? This is from having a minor intellect, v'shar midos, and so too the other midos, right? And continues the Alter Rebbe, v'eser b'chinas elu hatmeos, k'sh'adam mechashev behen, and medaber esa, and these 10 unclean faculties, when a person or unclean categories, interesting language. When a person meditates in them, you think about them, or you speak in them, or you act by them, הרי מחשבתא שבמוחו ודיבורא שבפיו וכוח המעשה שבידו ושאר איבריו נקראים לבושי מסבה לעשר בחינס אלו הטמאס שמסלבשס בהם בשעת מעשה דיבור או מחשבה. Your thought in the brain and speech in the mouth and action which is in the hands together with the outer limbs are called impure garments of these 10 unclean categories, in which the latter are enclosed at the time, I'm reading the translation here, at the time of action, speech, or thought. In other words, you have 3 impure garments, right? And just like the 3 holy garments which surround the entire soul, as we explained in chapter 4, right? When a person involves themselves in one of these garments, in an impure way, and the soul's impure love or fear is expressed in one of the 3 garments of thought, speech, or action, those 3 garments are also impure and become impure thereby. And just as we said in chapter 4, just as the garments of the godly soul are more holy than the love and fear which create them, in the animal soul it's the opposite. The garments of the animal soul can actually be worse and more lowly than the love and fear of the animal soul which leads to them, as we will explain later in the chapter. So long story short, in summary of today's class, the animal soul is like the godly soul with a few key differences, but basically the animal soul has all of the faculties and all of the pieces of the godly soul, but in the side of klipa and impurity. We'll continue next week.